Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to some more Warhammer 40k lore. I am sure by now we are all well acquainted with the Tyranid threat. This invading species of monstrous Xenos aliens who simply devour anything and everything in its way, stripping entire worlds down to the bare rock and then moving on to do it to yet other planets, in a way that seems singularly predatory, in that it seems to have no other concerns besides eating everything in its path. Now, this, from a larger lore perspective, has several problems, like, what are they going to eat when they run out of food? And with the suggestions that the Tyranids are out there in the wider 40k universe, supposedly in enormous numbers, did they run out of stuff to eat? Are they now merely drifting in hypersleep from one barren galaxy to the other? Were they some sort of weapon created by the Old Ones in their war against powers unfathomable? Perhaps even they were an anti-chaos weapon, designed to rid the galaxy and the universe at large of life. Perhaps they're simply guard dogs, placed around the Milky Way galaxy by some hitherto unknown super species that has decided to isolate themselves from the one place in the universe where chaos seems to be bleeding forth. There are a whole lot of theories surrounding this, but there has been a rather interesting twist. One of the few pieces of new, quote-unquote, as in post the fall of Cadia lore, that I find rather intriguing, and that is the planet of Ziaphoria, where the Tyranids are for once not simply devouring it and stripping it of its biomass. Instead, they appear to be actively constructing something, covering the planet in enormous Tyranid organisms and buildings. Some spires reaching the height of mountains, and some constructions so vast as to cover, reportedly, entire continents. This would have required a truly ferocious quantity of biomass as well, by the way. A truly absurd expenditure. That is, of course, unless they have a very specific purpose in mind. A purpose for which they are willing to expend quantities of biomass that would normally fuel a splinter fleet for a very, very long time indeed. And so, of course, we are now going to speculate as to what that thing could be. First and foremost, Ziaphoria is a planet somewhere probably in Segmentum Obscurus, possibly in Ultima Segmentum as well, as all we know is that it's somewhere along the northern reaches of the Milky Way galaxy, and that it has drawn Genestealer cultists from at least one previously chaos-occupied planet known as Heinrich's March, the precise location of which is unclear. The inability to locate the precise position of Ziaphoria might even be an Imperial ploy, as the planet has been classified as quarantine extremis, in that it is to be avoided by all Imperial servants, and not just the planet itself, but space surrounding it, to a pretty damn enormous radius. This is because Hive Fleet Tiamat, the Hive Fleet, or more likely probably Tendril, that has taken up base on Ziaphoria, have been defending the system extraordinarily aggressively, to the point where the Imperium, already embattled on countless other fronts, simply decided to abandon the planet and nearby space to the Tyranids, probably thinking that, well, somewhat uncharacteristically, the murderous predatory Xenos aren't actually bothering anybody else at the moment, so that gives us the opportunity to deal with one of the other 5,000 fires raging across the Imperium. This prioritization might be a really, really terrible idea, incidentally. As if the Tyranids are building something they don't want you to touch, it's probably really, really, really incredibly important. And the only ones paying any degree of attention to it whatsoever at the moment are some small elements of the Death Watch and the famous Inquisitor Cryptman, who has been paying close attention to the Tyranids' business in the galaxy in general. Now, the Death Watch have been launching a couple of minor expeditions towards Ziaphoria, nothing capable of actually figuring out what's going on the planet beyond that one Death Watch kill team was exposed when their librarian went crazy. Psychic overload kinds of crazy, presumably due to a vast psychic emission that came from one of the tremendous towers on the planet, indicating that whatever the Tyranids are doing there, there's something psychic about it. Now, this could simply be a defensive mechanism to protect the world against psychic threats, chaos, for example, or invading psychic species, of which there are quite a few in the 41st millennium. It could also simply be that the librarian was not ready to receive a psychic communication on the scale that the Tyranids might enact on a world like that. As, well, we already know the Tyranids are a psychic species, so how much more loud and psychic could something the size of a continent be? The Death Watch kill team managed to deliver one final report, simply stating what had happened, what had occurred to their librarian, and that their position was now about to be overrun. Ever since, the Death Watch has been interested in carrying out further reconnaissance missions, but they have not been able to really figure out much more. Inquisitor Cryptman, too, of course, has many theories, but none of which have really managed to gain purchase in the wider Imperium. So, with what we know, what can we deduce from all of this? The most obvious thing to think would, of course, be some sort of vast psychic beacon. It's already been more or less confirmed that the Tyranids were pulled into the Milky Way galaxy by the Pharos beacon, indicating that the Tyranids are of course able to communicate or receive messages at extraordinary distances. I mean, they have to, otherwise an organization like the Tyranid hive mind would simply be impossible. So it stands to reason that they might have some way of communicating, again, over absolutely enormous intergalactic distances. Now, perhaps this has something to do with size, or access to the commanding organism that stands behind the Tyranids as a species, as whilst we can probably assume that there has been an element of guiding intelligence to the Tyranids' approach so far, as they have assaulted our galaxy in several waves, at the very least 2 major waves already, and that it is assaulting in vast tendrils, it seems silly and perhaps naive to assume that all of this is just coincidental, that whatever forces the Pharaoh's beacon drew in just happened to arrive in this particular order. Simultaneously, though, if one was to assume a guiding intelligence, it seems to be a retarded one. It genuinely does seem to be a retarded one, as it has elected to attack our galaxy on as wide a front as humanly possible, and getting their asses kicked as a product. Now, mayhaps this was simply because the guiding intelligence was like, okay, well, I don't know what's over here, so I'm going to do a reconnaissance in force. I'm going to spread myself out nice and wide and try to get a picture of the opposition here. Entirely possible. In which case, the next step might very well be to go, right, I know roughly what's happening here. It seems able to resist my reconnaissance in force. In fact, it has brutally annihilated several of my hive fleets now, to the point where I have resorted to de facto skirmishing with splinter fleets instead. What's the next step? Well, reinforcements, of course. And if we then assume that the Tyranids were either guided by a central intelligence, it would now know that this is the time, or that they were dispatched with a form of directive, a element of programming, where it goes, okay, wander over there, see what's over there. If you start suffering casualties of a certain percentage, or your conquest is so and so slow, call for help. Makes perfect sense. And since we also know that the Tyranids are capable of communicating across very, very significant distances already, with things like Norn queens, it would stand to reason to assume that the larger the organism, the greater the potential range. And since we are now communicating across intergalactic distances, we are going to need a very, very large organism. But it just being a beacon is kind of boring, too, at the end of the day. Really, the Tyranids emerged, got their asses kicked because they were morons and spread themselves out across an enormously wide front, and now they're crying for help. I mean, it's certainly a galactic threat, as there is no doubt a huge quantity of additional gribbly-grabblies out there in the universe, but it feels a little underwhelming. What other potential uses could a Tyranid bioorganism the size of a planet be put to? Well, let's see. One of the unique challenges, of course, that the Tyranids have encountered in our galaxy is chaos. If we entertained the idea that the Tyranids might be an old one concoction specifically to avoid the Tyranids or to destroy them, or indeed the Necrons, then that theory falls somewhat apart. But let us assume for the moment that chaos is something that the Tyranids really, really don't like. And we have some evidence to suggest this, as they have tended to avoid them in the past. However, there are also Tyranid hive fleets that seem practically specialized to deal with demons. And indeed, one of the very first target for hive fleet Tiamat and Ziaphoria was, as mentioned, a chaos-held world. So, let's now dive into the Genestealer cult aspect of this, shall we? The Creed of Tiamat. The chaos-held world of Heinrich's March was a classic chaos-held planet, where they were working the local populace to the bone, when a local religious leader who referred to himself as the Conduit rose up against his chaos masters, rallying enormous numbers, millions upon millions of serfs to rise up, rebel, and escape the planet, abandoning it in favor of a paradise beyond the stars. He then brought himself and his followers to Ziaphoria, where instantly upon touching the soil, they became fully brainwashed and mind-controlled, presumably by whatever guiding intelligence is currently running Hive Fleet Tiamat. These cultists were then dispatched further out into the galaxy yet again, to bring the Creed of Tiamat to the masses. This suggests a couple of things. One, the Hive Fleet appears to be recruiting. Why is, there's many reasons. One could be additional biomass brought to the planet, as it probably had a snack or two when the cultists arrived. Then it dispatched the rest back out into the galaxy to bring yet further food to the planet. That would make sense. Another one would be to spread the word of the planet as well, perhaps understanding that psychic effects are somewhat based upon belief as well. Thus, the stronger the image of Ziaphoria grows in the minds of normal people, the more powerful it might get in the war. This, incidentally, leads me to another one of my favorite theories here, namely that the Tyranids are adapting to our galaxy's rules and to the rules of chaos. Now, this is based on precisely nothing other than I like the idea, so bear that in mind, but remember, yet again, the warp makes things real. And it is also affected by our own beliefs. What if the Tyranids were thinking, okay, chaos is obviously an enormous danger to us. It is a dimension beyond our understanding that can bring forth literally limitless numbers of demonic entities to murder us. And they also don't produce any biomass whatsoever. This is a really shit foe for us. How do we fight such an enemy? Well, we've eaten a lot of specialists in this field by now, and we've figured out some rough and general rules, like chaos is shaped by reality, and chaos in turn also shapes reality, to the point where you can create entities with very real corporeal power via belief. What if we, with the ability to literally brain control people and therefore force them to believe certain things, we create the belief of a Tyranid super entity, a Tyranid warp god? We could enforce that belief to a degree and on a level that virtually no other species could match. We could, in fact, in essence, recreate the miracles of the Eldar, who understood on a societal level that chaos and the warp at the time could be used as tools and directed specifically towards specific purposes. The Tyranids can do the same. This could get very, very interesting very quickly, as not only would it allow the Tyranids to potentially begin manipulating reality, but it could also create specifically an anti-chaos Tyranid entity. As how do you fight an enemy that is non-corporeal, an enemy that you cannot reach with tooth and claw, an enemy that lives in a different dimension than yours? Well, you figure out how to get into that dimension and how to give yourself tooths and claws inside of that dimension. After all, the Tyranid are supposed to be the ultimate predators. Surely they would begin thinking of a way to predate even upon the immaterial. But again, this is based on absolutely nothing other than it would make a certain degree of sense, and it would work. Theoretically, technically, depending upon how we think that, well, brainwashing affects the warp. Does a mind remain a mind even if it is controlled by another mind? Or does that simply just become one mind in 1,000 bodies? There's some food for thought there. What else, then, could Hive Fleet Tiamat be building on Ziaphoria? One tempting thought is some sort of super organism. The Tyranids have realized that whatever's living in this galaxy is extraordinarily hostile and apparently pretty good at war, to the point that when we need to engage them either in space or on the ground, we actually run the genuine risk of losing. And of course, the problem for the Tyranids here is that they are expending resources with every engagement. If they actually fail to take a world, or even worse, they expend huge quantities of resources to take the world, and then the Imperium drops a cheeky exterminator's weapon on it just as they leave, they're actually spending more than they're gaining. Indeed, this was one of Inquisitor Cryptman's main weapons against the Tyrannids, essentially trying to make them burn themselves out. Now, this is obviously very, 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 very difficult, because the Tyranids are very difficult to stop. And once they actually do manage to capture a planet, they obviously regain virtually all of the biomass expended in capturing it, as they eat their own carcasses just as happily as those of the enemy. Nevertheless, invading a world brings with it certain risks. Fighting the enemy in space also brings with it certain risks. What would be the best way to negate many of these risks? Well, what about a planet-sized organism that doesn't actually need to invade a planet at all? Think a Unicron, but organic. Just a truly vast, ultra-mega organism that moves up to a world and just fucking chomps it. How do you stop that? Just barrage it with exterminator's weapons, core breakers, and hope to do some damage? I mean, I guess. One could certainly argue that a target of that size would be difficult to miss, if nothing else. But there are several other potential drawbacks to this as well. One of the main problems is that all living organisms, and bioorganisms like these would be living, will need to constantly burn a certain amount of energy to simply stay alive, to continuously circulate whatever fluid it needs to pass oxygen or whatever it requires to live through its veins. And all of this will depend upon the size of the organism. Something the size of a planet would probably burn a truly tremendous amount of energy just to live, even if it will presumably be optimized to go into a form of deep sleep when it isn't required to actively chomp something. Still, it would be expensive. Absurdly so, and the amount of biomass expended not just to operate this thing, quote unquote, but to build it in the first place, I don't know if it would pay for itself, let's put it like that, though I will also point out that this would also work in well with the idea of the Genestealer cults. Normally, of course, Genestealer cults are used as a part of the psychic beacon that attracts the hive fleet to planets. Then, once the hive fleet arrives, the cult will rise up in an effort to overthrow, or at the very least weaken, the local defenders. Preferably, they will outright defeat them, handing the hive fleet an easy victory and a quick snack. Obviously, this doesn't always succeed, but that's the ideal. The primary purpose, however, remains to guide the hive fleet to the snack. And the Cult of Tiamat is already doing that. It is already spreading its disciples across the galaxy. Disciples that it has already linked with, or in other words, marked. This could be both for, again, weakening planets, which would be useful, or alternatively also simply to pre-scout its snacks. As we've already come to determine, this thing is going to require an enormous amount of energy to live, an enormous amount of biomaterial to live. And so it would make an enormous amount of sense to check out where these resources are before deploying the mega ultra giga planet killing Tyranid. It would be cool. It'd be very cool, in fact. I don't think it's likely, but it would be cool. What else could it be doing? It could be a shroud. So, obviously, the Tyranids don't bother with warp travel. Instead, they can do shallow dives using their narwhals. And they also just simply travel through real space, putting their entire fleet on ice, so that it consumes as little resources as possible. This places it at an obvious strategic disadvantage compared to most of the other factions of the 41st millennium. However, if this disadvantage could be either reduced or entirely eliminated, well, if a beacon could be created that blankets out the warp, something along the lines of the same already existing phenomenon of the shadow in the warp, it would affect the Tyranids a bit, sure, but nowhere near as much as it would affect everybody else. And it would make sure that the enemy couldn't really move, couldn't really communicate, couldn't react effectively to the advances of the Tyranid hive fleet. And again, sure, it would slow down the Tyranids' advances as well, but what the hell does the Tyranid care? They have literally all of eternity to eat us all in. So what possible difference would it make to the hive mind if it ate us today, tomorrow, or 1,000 years from now? The primary point is to reduce our ability to resist, and thus guarantee that every time the hive fleet assaults a planet, it gets away with more biomass than it invested in destroying it. It would also be a wonderful anti-chaos tool, if indeed the primary threat to the hive fleet are infinitely respawning bloodletters, as it would be somewhat reasonable to assume, then blanketing out the warp would be a pretty effective way of dealing with that. Yet another, and probably the final theory, is what is the main weakness of the Tyranid hive fleet? Well, it's synaptic network, really. That remains one of the most easily exploitable weaknesses of the Tyranids, namely that its enemies can simply blow up the biggest amongst them, and suddenly all of the little ones grow feral. Or even better still, you can blow up the main commanding vessels, and all of the Tyranids go feral, and become easy prey to whatever species they were trying to bully, and are now being bullied by. How to deal with this? Maybe a galaxy-spanning psionic network. That would get rid of the Tyranids' main weakness. And even if it doesn't work on a smaller individual Tyranid level, so that killing the hive tyrant still causes a breach in the local synaptic net, if simply all of the various splinter fleets and all of the various hive fleets can finally be made to coordinate properly via a centralized command and control system, a boss Tyranid existing somewhere in the galaxy, that would be a pretty enormous deal. It would make Games Workshop get rid of the synaptic link rule, however, which is why that's probably not happening, as, well, it's kind of, core to the Tyranids being and all that. And at the end of the day, I would also point out that probably none of these theories will ever be considered, far less so proven true or anything, as at the end of the day, Ziaphoria is probably just going to be one of those Tyranid things. One of those plot points that GW is like, ooh, tendrils coming from outer space. Ooh, there's something horrifyingly large out there somehow, somewhere, and it's really dangerous and might come for you next. And then it never arrives, as the Tyranids have pretty much just evolved into being munching monsters now. That's their role in the story, that's their role in the galaxy, that's their role in the universe at large. And seeing as it's been 6, 7 years since the introduction of Ziaphoria. By this point, yeah. It's probably nothing. In all due likelihood, in another 6, 7 years, we will all ask ourselves, hey, do you remember that giant thing the Tyranids were building? Yeah. Whatever happened to that thing? Did we ever get any closure on what it was or why or anything? No. No, we didn't. And no, we won't. But still, it's nice to indulge in a little bit of theory crafting every now and then, isn't it? And there are lots of interesting things you could do with a planet-sized Tyranid, whether you make it into a supermind or an enormous munchy monster. At the very least, it would give everybody something else to deal with. And, well, there's also the whole idea that the Tyranids and the Necrons aren't supposed to be the best of friends, with also the potential idea that the Tyranids were created specifically to deal with the Necrons by the Old Ones. If the Tyranids were creating some sort of super organism to end this war once and for all in the galaxy, it could be a pretty cool Tyranids versus Necrons mass-scale campaign, couldn't it? But now I'm really talking out of my arse. A Games Workshop round campaign that doesn't star the Space Marines in the leading role? Yeah, not going to happen. Still, it's fun to theory craft, occasionally. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.